Margaret Lawson stood at the kitchen window of her new home, watching the afternoon light paint the Appalachian hills in shades of rust and gold. 30 years of apartment living, of sirens, footsteps overhead, the constant hum of human proximity had worn her down to nothing. At 62, she wanted silence. Her husband, David, promised her exactly that. The farmhouse sat on 12 acres, isolated between a forested ridge to the north and a steep ravine to the south. The realtor had been almost too eager to close the sale, accepting their offer before even listing the property publicly. That should have worried her. It didn't. Their son, Ethan, arrived that evening with Lily, his pregnant wife, and Margaret's daughter, Sophie, who at 19 was running from something Margaret never quite asked about. They were all looking for escape. They found the house instead.
This can't be real.
The first week was perfect. They renovated the kitchen. Sophie painted her bedroom a soft lavender. Lily planted flowers in the garden, her swollen belly a promise of new life. David and Ethan repaired the porch railing while Margaret watched from a rocking chair, sipping tea, finally breathing. Then came the knocking. It started on a Wednesday night at 2:17 a.m. 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. Margaret heard them before David did. She hadn't been sleeping well, though she wouldn't have admitted why. The knocks had a quality to them, a patience, like whoever stood outside could wait forever. David went down with a flashlight. Margaret followed, her heart moving erratically in her chest. The porch was empty. The dirt road stretched into darkness, unmarked. No footprints, no car, nothing. "Probably just branches hitting the frame," David said, but his jaw was tight. Old houses settle differently. The knocking didn't sound like branches. It came again the next night, same time, same 3 knocks, same emptiness behind the door. By the third night, nobody moved when they heard it. Sophie stopped sleeping. Margaret found her at midnight, standing in the hallway, listening to the knocks as if deciphering a message in Morse code. When Margaret asked her what she was doing, Sophie said something that made her mother's blood run cold. "It's getting faster." She was right. The knocking accelerated over the next week, not in tempo, but in frequency. It came at 2:17 a.m., then again at 3:44 a.m., then at 11:23 p.m., sometimes twice a night. Sometimes the intervals between knocks grew impossibly long, as if whoever stood outside was thinking between each strike. Ethan found scratch marks on the inside of the front door, long, methodical gouges in the wood, as if something had been testing the door's integrity from the inside, though none of them remembered anyone scratching anything. Margaret insisted they call the police. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw came out, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes. He found nothing. He suggested installing motion sensor lights, which David did immediately. The lights activated 6 times that first night, triggered by nothing visible. "Maybe deer?" Bradshaw said, but he looked at the scratch marks for a long time before leaving. The real deterioration started with Lily. She'd been vibrant, always smiling despite her anxiety about the pregnancy. One morning, Margaret found her in the kitchen, staring at nothing, her coffee cold. Lily's hands trembled. She'd lost weight despite eating constantly. When Margaret tried to hug her, Lily flinched. "The baby," Lily whispered. It's not moving right." The doctor found nothing wrong, but Lily knew her own body. She could feel something was off, as if the child within her aware of something outside of her, something that frightened it into silence. Ethan became protective, almost obsessive. He stopped sleeping in their bedroom, instead staying up all night in the living room, watching. Watching what, he wouldn't say. Margaret noticed he'd begun writing things in a notebook, obsessive notes about sounds, times, patterns. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic. Sophie stopped speaking entirely. She would sit in her lavender bedroom, still fully clothed despite the warm weather, and stare at the wall. Margaret found her one afternoon with her fingernails bloody from picking at the paint, as if trying to claw through to something beyond. Margaret herself had begun experiencing episodes, anxiety attacks that came from nowhere, leaving her gasping, her heart throwing itself against her ribs like a prisoner. The family doctor prescribed sedatives. They didn't help. More disturbing were the moments of missing time. Margaret would walk into a room intending to check on Sophie, and suddenly she'd be standing in the basement, having no memory of the stairs. Once she found herself in the garden at 3 a.m., soaking wet with dew, with no recollection of leaving her bed. David wasn't sleeping either. He'd taken to walking the property at night with a rifle, though he'd never hunted and barely knew how to hold the weapon. When Margaret asked him what he was protecting them from, he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but recognition, as if he was finally understanding something that had always been obvious. It's not trying to get in, it's trying to get out. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly at those words. She drove to the county records office the next morning, something she'd been avoiding since they moved in. She found the property history. The land had been farmland in the 1800s. Then the cemetery had been established 2 miles north, later relocated in the 1950s due to flooding. But there were records of unmarked graves on this property, the ones that hadn't been found, that hadn't been moved. The family that owned the house before them had lasted 3 months. The owners before that, 6 weeks. One owner in 1987, a man named Raymond Kellerman, had been found in the basement, having hanged himself from a beam. The note they found was illegible, filled with obsessive repetition of a single word: between, between, between. Margaret felt something slot into her mind, not comfort exactly, but the terrible peace of understanding. She called a priest that evening, Father Thomas from the Catholic Church in the nearest town. She told him everything, and instead of dismissing her, he was quiet for a long moment. "Has anyone tried to leave yet?" Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "Some places," he said slowly, "aren't interested in trapping people inside. They're interested in keeping people from leaving. There's a difference." That night, Lily tried to run. She made it to the car, keys in hand, nearly to the end of the driveway when she stopped walking. Just stopped. She stood there for 20 minutes in the darkness, the car running, unable to take another step. When David brought her back inside, she was screaming silently, her mouth open, her voice simply gone. The next morning, Margaret gathered her family. "We have to leave," she said. "All of us, now." They packed in frantic silence. As they loaded the cars, Margaret felt it, a presence in the house, not hostile, but demanding. It didn't want them to stay. It wanted them to stay until they became part of it, or it wanted them to understand that they'd already chosen to stay. As they pulled away down the driveway, Sophie suddenly screamed and pointed. In the attic window of the house, a face appeared, a woman's face, pale and hollow-eyed. It looked exactly like Margaret. They didn't stop the car. Margaret never spoke about what she saw in that window, or what she understood about what had been standing at the door all those nights, knocking with such patient insistence. Because some understanding, once reached, should never be spoken aloud. The house sits empty now, between its hill and its ravine, but the knocking continues every night, and the locals know better to ask who lives there.